We're pleased today to have Michael Gorman, the author of Reading Revelation Responsibly and a number of other books. He teaches at St. Mary's in Baltimore, and we're so pleased to have you join us today to talk a little bit about some of the themes of Revelation. So welcome, Mike.
Thanks, Brian. I'm glad to be here. I'm really disappointed I can't be with you in person like we were supposed to be this weekend.
Yeah, we're disappointed too, but we appreciate making time for us to talk,
Sure.
at least in this format. So yeah, as we begin to think about Revelation, you've done a lot of thinking and writing on the book of Revelation. What are some basic things that you would want listeners to keep in mind, as they try to read Revelation in a responsible way?
Right. Yeah. Well, one of my friends says that people either love or hate Revelation. There's this long spectrum, and people tend to be on one end or the other. They obsess over it or they neglect it. And I don't think either of those is healthy, obviously, but I think it's important to remember a couple of things about Revelation when we jump into it. First of all, contrary to popular opinion, the book of Revelation is not primarily about the end of the world. It's not primarily about the Antichrist. It's about the living Christ and about his will for us now. So even though it does talk about the future and ends, obviously, the canon with this new heavens and new earth, it's really a letter and a message to Christians in the first century and in the 21st century about how to live the faith today. It's not just about the future, it's about Christ and the present. Also, I think it's important to keep in mind that this is a work of apocalyptic literature. And apocalyptic literature, unfortunately, is often misunderstood as doomsday literature, and it is that in part. But more importantly, for interpreting Revelation, we have to remember that apocalyptic literature is like a series of political cartoons. It's symbolic, and everything about it has to be interpreted as symbolism for what it is. So those are two things to keep in mind. There's probably some others, but certainly those are really important. And I guess I would add, when we think about Revelation, it's not just an apocalyptic doomsday kind of book as people often associate it with, but it's also a real life letter. This was written to real churches in the first century about how to live out their faith. And I think it's really interesting that at the end of each of the messages, it says, listen for what the Spirit is saying to the churches, plural. And I think we can interpret that to mean the churches not only in the first century, but also the churches today as we move on into the period of Revelation, of interpreting Revelation as we go through the centuries.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So as we think about what it means to live faithfully, and we think about, okay, well, what would that have meant for the churches in the first century, but also trying to reapply that today, in the first century church living in the shadow of the Roman Empire, and us in a very different situation today. One of the things you talk about is this notion of civil religion as we think about translating the church living under empire to the church living today. And I think for probably a lot of people, particularly in the US, that can be hard to start getting our minds around because we're not necessarily used to thinking about that. Some of that, I think, is probably because of our history as a nation. But could you unpack a little bit about what you mean by civil religion? What do you think the dangers of it are in terms of faithful resistance, and what civil or uncivil obedience? What does that look like?
Yeah. So maybe if I can step back for a moment and just go back to the Revelation and its original context. What most scholars today would say is that the book of Revelation has a message of strong critique of the Roman Empire, but not just the Roman Empire. It has a strong critique of what the Roman Empire embodies and symbolizes. So Revelation is a kind of, as I say in the book, a kind of manifesto against that way of being in the world that's represented by Roman political, economic, military, and social structures. So one way of describing that reality is to say that the book of Revelation is talking about civil religion, religion that is really a guise for political power. So in the first century, Rome believed that it had been sent by the gods, established by the gods, to rule the world and to bring peace and security and justice and all those good things that every nation wants and every people wants. So the way that Rome did that was, of course, by conquering other nations and by deterring violent or even non-violent resistance by virtue of crucifixion and other forms of mass killing. So what we have in the Roman Empire then, and therefore in the book of Revelation, is two competing worldviews about what it means to be human, what it means to be political in the world. And so as we read the book of Revelation, we see this being portrayed in a variety of ways, as a kind of what I refer to as a demonic or unholy trinity. You have the two beasts and the Satan power behind them. So civil religion, I have a long definition in the book, but civil religion is basically the idea that you can make a secular state sacred and that you can therefore make secular responsibilities, alleged responsibilities, into sacred responsibilities. At the same time, let me just read a short quote here. It involves power. So civil religion is about attributing sacred status to secular power and to all that goes with it, its stories, its narratives, its claims, its rituals. So what civil religion is then is making something that's supposed to be the true worship of God into a form of idolatry, and allegedly making idolatry into the true worship of God. And as long as we understand that religion is not just about what we do on Sunday morning, or in the case of Rome, we do in our private altars or in the temples in the public square, but it's how we live and how we embody that kind of faithful or unfaithful service to God, then the idea of marrying church and state becomes very problematic, something to question and to resist.
Yeah, so that's helpful. I think so. I think in terms of the Roman Empire, we think about sort of power being fused together with kind of pagan ideas, pagan, what you might say, theology.
Right.
I think a lot of people, particularly in the U.S., would see kind of the nation state of the U.S. as in a little bit of a different category, because they would say, well, it's sort of fused together with Christian or at least Judeo-Christian values and ideals. And so how do we kind of make the translation from Christian empire to the relationship between nation state and power, idolatry, the sacred? How do we think about that today?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that really struck me when I was writing this book was how prevalent and how almost under the radar screen civil religion is. And I say under the radar screen, not because it's not visible, but because we take it for granted. And I think we take it for granted because we in America, many people believe that we were either founded as a Christian nation and we've strayed from our roots, so to speak, or we are a Christian nation, or at least we have a lot of very strong Christian influences. And at least for the third one, there's probably some truth to that. But what I often will say to my students is, there are a lot of things I never noticed until I noticed them. Now, that sounds pretty obvious, but let me give you my kind of go-to example. When I was about 21 years old, for the first time, I had to buy tires for my car. And I had lived in the same town most of my life, so I never thought. I'm sure my father bought tires, but I had never bought them myself. So where do you buy now? Main drag, main highway that runs through town. And suddenly I realized that in my little town, there were probably 25 places to buy tires. And I had never noticed a single one of them before I started looking for them. I think it's the same thing with civil religion. We take these things for granted that have become part of our culture over the years, not realizing how dangerous they are and how watered down version of Christianity they are. I sometimes refer to them as Christianity light. And it's because they are this watered down version that uses oftentimes Christian language. The danger is even greater, perhaps, than it would have been for Christians in the Roman Empire, who would have been seduced by similar things: military power, economic power, security, peace, all the things that people want, especially security and safety and peace, justice. They would have been, in the first century, Christians would have realized this is a pagan, idolatrous culture calling us to obey. And that would have still been difficult, but at least they would have known it was pagan. Our problem in the 21st century, and has been for the entire life of this nation, I would say, is that there is this kind of mix of Christianity and something else. And it makes it more enticing because it has this flavor of the Christian faith built into it. And so it's harder for us to be critical, A, because it's our own country, and B, because it has this Christian veneer. And so we need to be willing and risk-taking enough to say, let's step back and examine what's really going on.
So do you think there's for the lack of a better way to put it, is there a Christian way to wield political power? Is there such a thing as a Christian infused nation state that can responsibly, or are you kind of veering off into theocracy at that point? I mean, how do you put together, or is that always a seduction into idolatrous power that we humans can never really handle very well?
Yeah, it's a great question. In a way, and this is not to be critical, but in a way I think it's the wrong question, because apart from the fact that most Americans vote, and who Christian Americans have some kind of political office, for most of us, the real question is, how do we live out the call of the gospel, including the call of the gospel we find in Revelation, in our ordinary lives, realizing that from the Bible's point of view, there's really no separation between personal life and public life, and therefore between a kind of deeply spiritual life and a deeply quote-unquote political life. And I don't mean a democratic life or Democrat life versus a Republican life versus independent, but a life that's lived in the public square. And so I think what Revelation is calling us to, and I will come back to the actual question you're asking, but I think this question is actually the more significant one. The question that Revelation asks is, what does it mean for us as a community to embody Lamb power? What does it mean for us as a community to be an alternative way of being people who do have a kind of power? And what does it mean to have that power? What does it mean to live that power out? So I like to think of the church as an alternative community. Not that we throw out everything, that we don't throw out everything about a culture. You can't do that. But we have to be critical and discerning about our culture, including the political dimensions of our culture, as we discern our life together. Can a Christian serve faithfully in political office? I would say the lower the level, the better. The town council, the mayor, yes. It gets more difficult with the greater degree and the greater kind of power one has. So it's, I think, very, very difficult to be a Christian president, because among other things, you're making decisions that not only affect your own country, but affect the entire world, especially when you're the president of the United States or a senator or congressperson or whatever. And my main interest in reading Revelation or in reading the New Testament is how we as a Christian community ought to live, not the specifics of particular powers. But I don't think the Bible, in particular the New Testament, is particularly concerned about trying to tell political powers how they ought to behave, other than that they ought to be just and merciful and so forth. But it's really more about shaping a people who live within those powers, as in the case of Revelation.
Yeah. So if we think about how we might live within the power, since that's where almost all of us live our lives, are there ways that we can sort of practically tell whether we are simply living as good citizens, as the New Testament talks about, praying for our leaders, and even loving our country and appreciating our country, and the things that are good about it. And when we've crossed over
Yeah,
into kind of civil religion or compromising, which is such a major theme within the book of Revelation, how do we practically tell when we've moved from one to the other?
that's a really difficult thing to decide and to discern. So I'm a big believer in discernment about these things, not prescribing, but viewing and opening questions in context. So I think part of the reason that question comes up when you read my book, I talk a lot about faithful resistance, and I give some general parameters about that. But I don't necessarily get into a whole lot of specifics, in part because I do think we have to work that out, and situation changes. I mean, I'm looking back at 10 years ago when I wrote Reading Revelation Responsibly. Our situation is somewhat similar in the United States to what it was then, but it's also somewhat different. And I think discerning faithful resistance today has a lot in common with what it did 10 years ago or 40 years ago, but it's also different from year to year and from decade to decade. So I think one thing that has to happen in the church is for us to at least recognize the problem. That's a big first step. And I'm really proud of what your church has been doing in the last few months to even look at these issues, that you have decided to preach through Revelation, Bryan, that your congregation is open to raising these kinds of questions. I think it's a huge first step and something to be very happy about. So, I mean, I think one thing that has to happen is that the churches need to do what you're doing and to begin to raise the questions, the hard questions. And for us as Christians to look and say, yes, we have been blessed by God to be in a position where we have relative freedom and relative opportunity in this country. But we also live in a nation that has a history of doing things and being things that are contrary to the gospel. And that's a hard first step for people to recognize. And then I think instead of just being critical of the culture or the country, we need to look into ourselves and begin to ask questions like, where have I personally, or where have we as a church perhaps unwittingly begun to compromise and to pay for the kind of security and safety, whether it's economic or political or military or whatever, that Scripture really calls us to trust in God for, and not to trust in political powers. And those are really hard questions for people to ask and to begin to discern and to think about. You know, one thing I think that I suggest in the book is that there are certain vocations or occupations that Christians need to think about. And that idea goes way back to at least the 2nd century with Tertullian, who at the end of the 2nd century said, there are certain things that the Christians shouldn't be doing because it involves either teaching or practicing idolatry. One of them was teaching in the public schools, so to speak, or the public environment. All today would say, well, that's a very normal thing for Christians to do, and it may be. But in that environment, and perhaps in other environments today, that could be a way of fostering a culture and an ideology that's at odds with the gospel. So I think all Christians, or most Christians at least, would say being a prostitute is not in line with the gospel. Can we step back from that and say, are there other ways of earning a living or of having an occupation that could also be problematic, just because the gospel calls us to a different way of economic activity or political activity? Those are hard questions, as I've said several times now, hard questions even to raise, but to begin to think about them and to take the risk of thinking about them.
Towards the end of your book, you actually, I think, raised the question about how can churches start having conversations around what you call Babylonian vocations or economic practices of injustice. From your time, both in the academy as well as in the church, what wisdom could you share in terms of how churches can have that kind of conversation in a way that's really constructive?
Yeah. Well, I think it needs to start at the top, but it needs to fizzle or dribble down pretty low. Kids start thinking about their vocations at a pretty early age. And if a church environment doesn't allow for the kinds of discussions that promote kids looking at their vocations, and even at parents looking at their future vocations, and parents looking at their current vocations with a self-critical eye, the conversation is never going to happen. So I think the pastor needs to take the lead. Sorry to put the burden on people like you. But I also think youth leaders in particular need to have the support of both the pastors and the parents to say, we're going to look at these questions as part of our ongoing youth group activities. You cannot go through you cannot go through 4 years at Knox without having I'll just pick a number out of the blue, 6-week session on Christian vocations. And that's not the idea of trying to encourage people to go into the ministry, so-called, but to think about what does it mean to offer one's body and soul to God in service, and in looking at a college major, looking at vocation, to think really carefully about the values that those different careers and vocations embody. So to have the risk, to take the risk, to have the courage to raise those kinds of questions needs pastoral leadership. It needs youth group leadership. It needs children's ministry leadership. And then it needs adults to be able to say, I'm willing to look at my own vocation. I mean, I've even had to look at my vocation as a seminary professor. You would think, wow, how could that be anything but a godly and church edifying profession? But it's not always the case. There are seminary professors who do more harm than good, and I don't want to be one of them. So I'm always looking at myself and saying, am I engaging in some kind of self-promotion? Am I engaging in activities that might somehow compromise my basic Christian commitments? Am I willing to do for my family things that might, because I believe I need to do them, that might have a negative impact on my so-called career, my moving up the ladder of success? That can happen in any profession. So those kinds of things need to be asked. I was once offered a position where I would have made, in terms of income, about 2.5 times what I was then making. And that was very tempting. It's a very specific discernment issue. I turned the offer down, but that can happen in any vocation. So what do you, that's kind of a generic question. Am I looking at my vocation as a gift and as an offering to God, or am I looking at it as a way to make an impact or make money or secure security? So those are kind of basic questions. But then there's also the question of, is what I'm doing somehow causing, either in a violent or an unjust way, harm to other people? And that's a very difficult question. But again, it's one that has to be asked.
Yeah, it reminds me of years ago, I was in a seminar with Ellen Davis, and there's a student who's a doctoral student in the seminar, and he was talking about how when he was an undergraduate student, he got really interested in how his food got to him. And so he began digging into the process of like how food is produced in the United States. And he became really, really disillusioned and disheartened. And he was sharing this story in the class, in the seminar. And he said, I just realized that there were things that were going on in the production of our food that I just had moral and ethical problems with. And yet I couldn't really find any way to get out of it. I'm just so enmeshed in this system. And I remember Ellen Davis saying something to the effect of, yeah, that's when discipleship gets really hard, when you realize that you can't extricate yourself fully from these webs and systems of injustice.
Yeah, that is very perceptive and very true. And that's why I used the word discernment earlier. We are called in Revelation to come out of Babylon. And that's, I think, a way of saying we need to discern about the practices that we cannot or should not participate in, and come out in order to go back in and to live as this alternative way. But Ellen is absolutely right. It is probably impossible to fully extricate ourselves from evil. The sweatshops in you name the country that we need to, quote unquote, need to manufacture our shoes, our computers, our smartphones, all those things. But while we can't extricate ourselves completely, I think we can make adjustments. We can, both in corporate ways and in individual ways, consider again the questions that Revelation poses to us. Questions about, are we doing things that are harming the environment, either deliberately or unintentionally, and how can we solve that? Are we doing things that goes against the new creation that God promises? Are we doing things that either unintentionally or intentionally contribute to global instability or global violence, whether it's the even questions of the military, which many Christians are just afraid to ask. So I think Revelation calls us to do those kinds of introspective moves, but I think Revelation also talks about real churches in the real world, and that's what we are. We can't go live on Mars and pretend we're going to create some kind of perfect colony there. It's not going to happen.
So, as you said, there are some kind of vocations and practices that are just very clearly not consistent with following the way of the Lamb or living in light of the gospel. But for a lot of things, it requires a real sense of discernment, because it gets into the complexities and murkiness of just living in the midst of a culture and a society in which things are rarely clear cut. So could you talk about a little bit just about the role of kind of worship and community as not just formational practices, but also as keys to discernment as we try to sort of live lives of faithful resistance, live lives that are faithful to the Lamb. Can you talk a little bit about those two aspects?
Yeah, sure. I mean, in two ways, worship is one of the most dangerous things we can do. It's dangerous in part because, on the one hand, because most churches are complicit in civil religion, and they don't necessarily either know that's what they're doing or don't think it's a bad thing to do. So I talk in the book about the sort of, I think it's in the book, but anyway, I talk somewhere about the two seasons in American public life. We have the sacred season, which runs approximately from Thanksgiving to Easter. And then we have the civil sacred or the civil religion season, which runs approximately from Memorial Day again to Thanksgiving. So you might even say the secular season goes to Thanksgiving and the sacred season picks up, the religious sacred season picks up at Advent or something. But I mean, there's so many seasons during the year, from the mild to the pretty in your face, that do this kind of civil religion. And so to go to church can be a dangerous thing. I have a neighbor who gets most excited about going to church on national holidays: Memorial Day, Veterans Day, and the 4th of July. Those are the most, quote unquote, to use his language, awesome worship he's ever experienced. To my mind, that's the most dangerous worship he's ever experienced, because he's putting these two things together. And so to the degree that worship is civil religion, and whether it's flags in the church or Pledge of Allegiance said at the beginning of the service on the 4th of July, or just talking about our veterans or our troops or our soldiers, as if the church had any of those things. The church's soldiers and veterans are called martyrs and missionaries. So that's one thing. That's what has to be resisted. That's the dangerous side of worship as we experience it, especially in this country, but in most countries. The powerful side of worship is that when we come to worship and are able and willing to check our idolatries, either before the service or after the service, we join with the whole universe, as Revelation 4 and 5 puts it. We join with the whole universe in acknowledging the one true God and the one true form of political power, Lamb power. You know, it's very interesting. In the book of Revelation, Jesus is described as the Lamb 28 times. That's 7 times 4, 7 being the biblical number for completion, 4 being a very universal, including biblical number for universality. So Jesus's power, Jesus's Lamb power, is complete and universal. So it's drawing all of us into this reality. And so, to the degree that we dispense with the worship of the cultural gods and the security that they give, represented by various things, and can be given over to the worship of the Lamb and of the God who's on the throne, really on the throne, not some commander-in-chief or some emperor. To the degree that we can do that, we will be transformed and be caught up into the worship that the whole universe can give, should give, is giving to the true God, to the one who's truly on the throne. So worship for the book of Revelation is at the core. It's this exciting reality as it's expressed in beatitudes and hymns and visions. And, I mean, Revelation's about worship, and so I get excited about good worship. I get depressed about civil religion worship.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for taking some time today and talking through with us some of the themes of Revelation and how those connect with our lives as followers of the Lamb. We really appreciate you taking a few minutes and chatting with us today.
Well, thank you. We talked a lot more about contemporary issues and about the book of Revelation itself, but Revelations, if I can just close with a couple of things, I think Revelation's a wonderful book, the way it closes the canon with the new creation. So we have these bookends of creation and new creation, and this vision of the nations being healed and being together with the presence of God and the Lamb, people who need to drink, people who are thirsty having their thirsts quenched, and just this beautiful conclusion, this beautiful invitation. So I get as almost excited about the book of Revelation as I do about good worship. And I wish I could have been with you for good worship this coming Sunday.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Mike.
Best to your church and to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure.
All right. Bye.
Bye.